Hello, everyone. It's the moment you all have been waiting for. It's the moment that every crime enthusiast has been waiting for. The final part of the Mikey Dongwook story will finally be complete. 3 more parts from now. Before we get started with this podcast, I want to thank the very people, including myself, that helped initiate this content and who helped push it out and actually helped me through the journey in 2021 to actually push this content out, actually push the podcast out. And not only that, but actually edit the very first podcast I ever made on any sort of platform. So I want to thank the therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists that helped me at the time back in 2018-19, who helped me during that point. I am now, since the last podcast, I was 20 years old, I think. And now I'm almost 24 years old. I'm actually 23 years old. And since then, it's been a long journey. It's been a grinding journey to get through college. Got my 4-year bachelor's degree from IU Bloomington. And since then, it's been a journey. It's been a ride and it's been a journey, just like the story has. And so it's a lot's changed since then. But the story of Mikey Dongwook and the vicious attack that he caused leaves trauma for everyone involved. If you are triggered, or you happen to have, or you are a victim of sexual abuse and assault, I highly advise you turn this off. But it won't be like the one back in 2021 where I'm going to go into the meat and potatoes of sexual assault, abuse, all that stuff. This is going to be more about Mikey Coe, how he's been in prison, and updates that we got last year about him. Viewer discretion is advised, and we thank you for listening.
In the summer of 2019, a vicious stabbing occurred at a music camp at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. The victim was a 13-year-old girl who met a boy named Mikey Coe the previous year. She almost was raped and sexually assaulted in a locker room at the IU Music Center and was stabbed multiple times in the thigh and stomach. As vicious as the crime was that Mikey committed, no one sounded the alarm until I came into the picture. I am Bear-Lents, and I was once a victim of bullying and insults from Mikey Coe. I was a victim of middle school shoving the problem away to make me feel worse. I bullied myself in 2016 and committed suicides multiple times until my final one in March of 2017. Since then, I have been stable, got help and the right treatment, and I graduated high school and will be an incoming sophomore at Vincent in Indiana University. It took me a while to get into a stable discussion about this boy, but here I go as hard as it was. This is my story of encountering a rapist, a bully, and a classmate. This is time to be unchained.
This podcast is also in collaboration with the Lagodi Big Al Times. The Lagodi Big Al Times is Lagodi, Indiana's #1 newspaper. We want to make it that way, with new podcasts and stories and interesting things to share in the Martin County area. This is one of our only stories that we have of the Bloomington area. We hope to also share more stories across the state of Indiana. But if you want to go subscribe to our newspaper today, you can visit our newspaper at www.lagoditimes.com. You can also search for Lagodi Times on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The following podcast may be a Braydyn production, but it's also a byproduct of the Lagodi Big Al Times newspaper. Subscribe today and read our headlines only on the www.lagoditimes.com. Again, that's www.LOOGOOTEE.times.com. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening. The interview. This is not only one of the most important episodes that I've ever had to cover on here, it is probably one of the most important when it comes down to factual information. For further context, I will be reading possibly word from an article that was posted last year on July 15th of 2024. That was posted on medium.com, and you can find it actually in the descriptions below. It is a members only story on Medium, so make sure you can check that out, and it's free. But if you want to actually actually not pay, you can go on Substack.com and read this entire article for free. So the Substack page is the Bear Man Journal, like bear, a grizzly bear, man, a masculine man, journal, like something you write on. And I will have those links down in the description below as we address today's podcast episode. My name is Braydyn Bear-Lents. I was once a former victim of Mikey Coe and his bullying. And this article was not only the most important thing I published, it described a lot of details I didn't know, and the public was more likely to know than me. Like I said, after this, I really want to put this to bed. And we're releasing this on June 27th, which is an important day, because IU Media School and most of the IU campuses are having orientation through the end of the month. And so we want to make this important, that there are monsters among us. There are people among us. There are a lot of people among us that have done wrong and cruel things. But this interview happened last year via Facebook Messenger. We did not actually do this in person or anything like that. The guy that I actually interviewed was a former convict that was actually placed in the Morgan County Jail with Mikey Coe in between for a few years, and I actually admitted on this article that there was a lot more to the story than people could act like. So actually, no, I got it wrong. It's the Clay County Jail. Actually, yeah, the Morgan County Jail to the Clay County Jail in Martinsville, Indiana. So we're going to cut the part out. So make sure in Washington, in Martinsville, Indiana. So we're going to actually read, I'm actually going to read the article and actually read it to you guys, what I wrote word for word, starting on the middle paragraph, which we just mentioned about the 2021 episodes and all that stuff that we went through yesterday. But this story provides you a glimpse of not just how messed up the system was to every victim, but also how the system messed with women, and more details about what Mikey is doing on the inside, which he is still, to this day, a master manipulator, according to the inmate, Jerry White. Here is the article word for word. It was published on July 15th of 2021, or July 15th of 2024. This story may be disturbing to some viewers, as this story discusses prison, inmate life, corruption, and attempted murder. Viewers' discretion for this entire part of the episode is advised, and I advise that if you are a victim of sexual assault or abuse, to log off and not listen to this podcast. This is your last warning before I read this message that I wrote last year on Medium and Substack, titled 5 Years After an IU Camp Attack, a former inmate opens up about experiencing Mikey Dongwook in jail. A former inmate of Dongwook, Mikey Coe, opens up about Coe, his jail experience, and secrets on the case that were never revealed. Here we go. A former cellmate of Dongwook Coe, who was convicted last year of murder, is now speaking about his experience with cellmates and interacting with Mikey Dongwook Coe while in jail. 5 years ago, on the day of July 12th, 2019, and I'm not going to read all this, but for many of you that are actually new to this podcast, I better get this out of the way. Mikey Dongwook Coe was a guy that had nearly murdered a 14-year-old high school IU, Jacob School of Music, string music camper on the campus of Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, that he knew from a previous camp the year before. Mikey had attempted to put the woman inside of a locker room and almost rape and sexually assault her, as we have discussed many times, in a private practice band room before leaving her cut and bruised, running away from the scene as the victim was left scared by the incident. When police found Coe on that day in 2019, he was questioned and once again booked into the Monroe County Jail in Bloomington, Indiana, on whether or not he was fit enough to stand trial. The victim's family challenged the court several times to make him stand trial, and the family, who was close with the judge and their family, had every hope of Ko receiving either a life sentence in prison or deportation back to the country of South Korea. The victim's trauma made her sheltered from the rest of the world for several years as Ko sat in jail in Morgan County, Indiana. Morgan County, Indiana. But even then, he was committing crimes. When he set up a hit list and hired a hitman while in jail that featured 9 victims he wanted to hurt, including the names of the victims' families, friends, students he attended high school with, and other affiliated family members. Last year, after Ko violated a plea agreement, he was found guilty on all charges of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 24 years in prison, where he now stands to this day and is possibly deported. As for a few of his victims, like myself, I received a massive level of support thanking me for opening up about the boy I knew him as Mikey. And we're not going to get into all the other parts of the next 3 paragraphs, which basically I talk about releasing the podcast. And even though this case was not a high profile case by any stretch of the imagination, I could have never expected it to be. But the love and support I received from recording this podcast was amazing and still is, because we're doing this for the second and final time. It's a new interest, and that's why we're bringing this up. But when I made this podcast in 2021, it was an audacious effort to hold my past in the past and move on with my future, away from knowing this kid, now a convicted prisoner, and who he once faked becoming. This was until more facts came out about the case. This is the interview that I had with this inmate last year in 2024 via Facebook Messenger. Ko, who I will refer to as, thanks to clarification given by former Clay County, Indiana jail inmate Jerry White, who commented on my podcast episode on YouTube in July 2024, claimed Ko was set up by jail staff multiple times as an unnamed and wired prisoner and played mind tricks on him while spending time in jail. The inmate, who I will repeat the quotes for and all that, said he deserves what he got for the girl, but the Clay County jail set him up. He said in an interview with Braydyn Bear-Lents, the guy who's me. They had a child molester who wasn't even supposed to be housed with Ko, wear a wire on Ko, and even capture him on camera. White was no stranger to being in prison. As I talked to him in 2000, we knew more about who White was and why he was with Mikey. In 2019, he was convicted of child molestation charges in Indianapolis and was booked into the Clay County Jail after being sentenced to a maximum term of 40 years in prison by a Marion County judge, which he was able to appeal. White and Ko were inmates at the Clay County Jail at the Morgan County Jail for the full 18 months of his stay. White said that the other inmates, along with himself, never messed with Ko, who they nicknamed Chow as in CHOW, while in jail. According to White himself, Ko and him shared a bunk together while in jail. He said Ko doesn't bother anyone, never says much, and is very reserved to himself and his cellmates. There was no word on if he was doing any activities such as working in jail, getting his GED or college diploma, or if he was advancing in his studies to occupy his time in prison. While in jail, White said Ko admitted to hiring a hitman and attempting his crime. He might have said more than that to another inmate in prison. Similar to the case of Jimmy Keene, who tried to get a confession out of a tri-state female murderer, Larry Hall, who was never supposed to be placed in jail at all, they tried to get a confession out of Mikey Ko, very similar to how they got the confession out of the tri-state murderer back in Indiana. White said that this was a setup either by the ICE team that was going to deport him or extract him to the prison, or by the prison staff along with the court system. In a quote from Jerry White, he said, Ko is a spoiled kid. I know that. But they broke the law to get him in. The guy wore a wire and got Coe to talk about his case in Bloomington. And he had Coe an investigator at the front of the jail. Coe was in a pod. The guy stood over Coe as he refused to say anything over a phone call in the jail, but the guy was threatening him. We all know that phones are recorded in prison. I'm not stupid to prove this was a conspiracy to commit murder-homicide. You have to have 3 charges against you. He had a motive, a reasonable attempt, and a money exchange. They faked all 3 things when questioning him. There was no money exchanged hands. Coe had his mom send a prison staff member $30 so he wouldn't have beat Coe up for not confessing. To try and help Coe get an honest treatment in prison, White tried his best to look into the case for himself, while the staff members were beginning to close in on a confession about Coe's whereabouts and what happened during the day in 2019. Regardless of how many attorneys Coe and his family paid from Indianapolis and Bloomington over the years, their case was never a case that was winnable for Coe and his family. One other thing that Coe confessed to was hiring a hitman while in prison and lying about his age while in the Morgan County and Clay County jails in Indiana. Whether that was Coe's narcissism or conning behavior, you be the judge. But one thing that both White and I agreed on was that Coe is evil. His crimes were well planned out, and Coe is a calculated, cold prisoner who should never be released back into society. As I learned more from White, my experience with Coe was different than his, and I understand. But he had found my podcast to be informative, and I thank him for opening up with me because we need to all know what Coe is capable of doing and what college girls could be susceptible to when they're visiting camps like this. To not really mingle with boys. It's okay to do that. Just be careful, because his time in jail is a cold place, and his prison life will be even colder, as White explained to me. That was our interview with Jerry White, a former inmate in the Morgan County and Clay County jails in 2024. What we can really analyze is that, especially from that interview, which was about, I'm not lying to you, it was several pages long. It literally felt longer than it actually was. But the interview with him was very starstruck and very eye-opening, as I learned more about his side of the story than Coe's side of the story. A lot of people can say that White, of course, basically was trying to help the feds and all this other stuff, but we can all agree that he did, in fact, admit to what Mikey had done. And he was open and honest, and I greatly appreciate that from him. I haven't heard from him since, but I'm glad that he was able to open up with me about that, because it's very helpful. But one thing he did actually mention to me, not only about this twisted case, was how the Court of Appeals in the state of Indiana, which we're going to get into as I'm starting part 3 right now, sent me this document along with our interview tape. And he said, and I did not record this, it was messages through Facebook Messenger, and I was just reading what he said. In a 14-page Court of Appeals document that he did send to me, filed by the state of Indiana, Mikey, who his nickname is Mikey, his real name is Dongwook Coe, was actually tried in the Court of Appeals in 2020, on September 20th, 2024, and it was Coe versus the state of Indiana, where he was the defendant and the state of Indiana was the plaintiff. And the court pretty much hit a nail right in the head with what Jerry White was saying, as Coe wanted to challenge his sentence and basically, using some of his conning measures, try to get himself out of a level 2 felony. As it says in documents with the opinions by Judge Brown, Judges May and Pyle, and the judges' names are on here. The judge of this case was the Honorable Robert A. Pell, judge in the state of Indiana, and it was the appeal from the Clay Superior Court back on September 20th of 2024 that challenged Coe's conviction of being convicted for a level 2 felony. It says in the document that was actually sent to me by Jerry and can also be found on the public courts website. If you go to public.courts.indiana.gov, there is a document on there if you search Dongwook, and you might be able to Google search it and find it as well, which was how I was able to find it. But it is online and it is for everybody's reading. But basically, the court wanted to challenge Coe on the level 2 felony. And it says in page 2, he contends the trial court erred in denying his motion to dismiss pursuant to Indiana Criminal Rule 4, that he was denied a fair trial due to the state's failure of preserve evidence, which we'll get into in a bit, and that the trial court abused its discretion in admitting certain evidence, which the judges confirmed. And it goes on in page 2 to talk about how he was basically in jail, how he stabbed the woman, how he basically stabbed the woman and everybody else, but how he stabbed the woman and wanted to create a hit list. But basically, ICE and other people, according to what it says in the document and to my interview with Jerry White, one thing that's fascinating is they questioned Coe many times into a confession. And the kid, and actually it says, and the inmate that did question Coe on a lot of this stuff was a Coe by the name, was a inmate in the Clay County Justice Center that was named Kelby Stuvall. And Stuvall confessed that Coe was actually the one who wanted to hire a hitman and do all that stuff. And it was and many people were saying that even though Coe was thinking about these thoughts, a lot of the stuff about his twisted mind were actually true. And he did include, in Coe's confession, according to the courts, it said other names on the list, the hit list that he planned, were the victim's wife, 3 Monroe County prosecutors, a reporter for the Herald Times in Bloomington, a friend of the victim's daughter, and 2 Indiana University professors, along with classmates and friends of his back when he was younger. And so it's going to go on and actually talk about, the link's going to be in the description below, I forgot to mention that. There was a lot, and it's to basically conceal it and basically conceal it all down. Coe was a big master manipulator who wanted to get away with more hurt and more casualties while he was in prison and while he was in jail. Not only is this very striking, but also the inmate Stuvall was going to get a confession out of Mikey from the police and ICE. They wanted to know more about the case. One day, Stuvall returned to the cell block from his meeting wearing a wire and told Coe he had some good news about his own case from federal prosecutors and invited Coe on a stress walk. When they arrived at the recreation room, Stuvall told Coe that his case was no longer going to the feds, and he also told Coe that he had spoken with his uncle, who told him his son and wife were sick. Whether that's true, we don't know. But then he switched subjects and said that Coe, when talking to his uncle, said that he wanted to talk to Coe about Operation Gold Crush, which was a code word, a code name that was given for him to basically confess to detectives William Nivell and Johnny Burnett about watching, because they watched every single move that Mikey had in prison. Every single move in jail was calculated, was precise by the detectives to get a confession out of Coe. And those were not words from the document. Some of those words were from the document, some of them were not. And so Stuvall basically spent a few months, if you go pages 5, 6, and 7, it does talk more about how Detective Nivell, a big figure in this case, and one of the Isbits, who was actually the last name of the kid or the girl that had almost gotten killed. That the detective knew the family well, and there was just a lot of twisted stuff in the case, including how he got a good on the $20,000, or I don't think it really means money, but I always wondered what that meant with 20K. Good on the 20K, and the family, along with him, along with Co, basically said, actually the detective said that Co was good on the 20K, but after having a phone call with this detective and with Co, he was really excited and confessed to being a killer. And so shortly after the call was finished, jail personnel conducted a shakedown of the cell block that Co was in, and they were able to find a piece of paper with the number 2500 on it with basically a price that his mother deposited in, and it was also a commissionary account fee. And so in 2021, after talking to Detective Novell, Co was later convicted of conspiracy to commit murder. And basically, I don't want to get into all of this very, very well, but basically, Co, as of that case in 2024, had no present witnesses and was about to be sentenced to 24 years in prison that he was trying to challenge on that day. The first issue raised in Co's briefing was that he was denying the motion to dismiss based on the Indiana Criminal Court for when he had been in custody for over 6 months with no delays attributable to him. And he claims that his incarceration greatly exceeded the requirement of Indiana Criminal Court Rule 4, and that we should therefore vacate his conviction. All of this because his court case was long. That's crazy. I even thought that at the time. Even reading this again, I'm like, that's crazy. So the courts delayed the sentencing for a few days and basically went into trial and basically was talking about what their best idea was, including to include evidence. And as we just mentioned, that Detective Novell, who did talk to Co, ended up saying that he was good and then confessed to more stuff later. But it wasn't voluntarily done. But the court found that it wasn't voluntarily done, that it was actually a joint mission to get Co to confess to evidence in his case in 2021. And now in 2024, they also use other court cases to analyze as if actually read any of this communication stuff. Thank you to Dr. Anthony Fargo at Indiana University for teaching me this, but if you actually read enough of these criminal cases, you will actually read that there's more common than not. There's more cases that are common than not in this case, including they mentioned Arizona versus Youngblood in 1988, the case of Terry versus State in 2006 that was later denied, Chiselle versus State in 1999, which that was also denied. And so basically, to read one of these. On the other hand, evidence is merely potentially useful if no more can be said that it could be subjected to test, the results of which might have exonerated the defendant. And this was in a case that was addressed in Chiselle and also quoting off of the Arizona versus Youngblood case in 1988. A lot of these documents, if you don't know anything about criminal law or any of that, it's very twisted and minding to read. You have to really read it word for word and not sentence to sentence. But Co, in this case, at the end of this, in section 19 and page 10, he did fail to point out any evidence to support his theory or any indication in the record that the video evidence taken by the detectives who used video and audio recordings to get a confession out of him. Basically, there was no evidence of coercion. Which basically, when this is all said and done, Co had no leg to stand on. And at the end of section 27 and 28 on page 13, it did say that May J. and Pyle J., the judges in this case, revealed that Coe only objected to the victim's family after the victim's family made all of the above mentioned statements, and his objective was only to any continued testimony regarding the prior conviction, claiming that the continued testimony could violate Indiana Evidence Rule 404B. And the trial court's ruling on Coe's pretrial motion in limine. Instead, defense counsel essentially conceded that the above testimony for probative and admissible was above testimony was probative and admissible, and that his objection was lodged simply so that the state would move on from his case. And they went ahead with his conviction. And since then, he is still facing time in prison. So some of the people involved in this, including the attorneys of appellant, along with the attorneys of appellant, were Preston Grimes, Jonathan D. Harwell of Harwell Gray Legal Counsel in Indianapolis, LLC. Attorneys for the appellate were Theodore E. Rokita, also known as Todd Rokita, the Indiana Attorney General, and Ellen H. Milinardi, a supervising deputy attorney general in Indianapolis. That's a lot to read, but basically, as we wrap up this episode, it is very, very clear to me that you have someone in this world that just seemingly doesn't care about anything but himself. And that's basically been the entire gist of the entire podcast for everybody. And if I didn't have this podcast to share how bad and manipulative he was all the way from high school, all the way from college, it's just nuts. And reading this again for the third time now in a script that's kind of jargy, that's kind of jagged because of everything that's been going on with the heat and that sort of stuff, and along with the fact that my script wasn't written very well for this podcast. I will say that some of the stuff was confusing because I wrote it about 2 or 3 years ago, but we can all agree that at the end of the day, this kid, this man now, around my age, believe it or not, my age, will probably and will be spending the rest of his life in prison and probably will be deported back to South Korea. No word on that yet, but for the victim and her family, you absolutely have to feel for them that they had shared all this evidence, they shared all the conclusive work, but Coe just wants a lesser sentence and thought he'd be deported, but he really isn't. So all in all, there were video and audio recordings. I know there was a lot of mix-up on that. But Detective Naval, who did interview Mikey Coe through audio and video, and so they were able to track his every move. Basically, if you watch this Netflix show, can't think of it right now, but it's a very big show, and it has an inmate wanting to basically get a confession out of another inmate. It is very, very good that that inmate was able to talk to him and get that confession out of the hitman and all that stuff. At the end of the day, though, there's really nothing we can do. The case is settled. The case is at this point, sealed. But his life is now in prison. What am I going to do? What are we going to do? The only thing we have to do is keep everyone safe. That's the first thing we can do. The second thing we can do is be aware and be mindful of everyone you talk to. Because if you don't talk to anyone, it might be better than talking to someone. And of course, what we've learned with this case is not every single person is evil. There's a lot of college kids I knew that were walking around talking to girls and they aren't evil. A lot of them are, some of them are not. But a lot of them are not that evil. And we can all agree that, for example, not a lot of rapists go to college. Not a lot of people that commit sexual assault are going to college. But at the end of the day, it is all about figuring out who your kids will be around at these camps. And as we make the voyage over into August and July and these hot months and the dog days of summer, we can all agree that this case, after this next part, which will be airing on the 29th, which is next Sunday, this episode will be coming out on tomorrow on June 27th, we can all agree this case is twisted, and many people wanted to get a confession out of him, which I really salute. But at the end of the day, there's really nothing we can do, and we can protect our children. And that makes me glad to not see this kid here ever again. I will see you all next Sunday. Have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you all soon as we post the last part of this entire podcast. Thank you so much. This is your host, Braydyn Bear-Lents. This podcast is in conjunction of the Lagodi Times newspaper based out of Lagodi, Indiana. The Lagodi Times is the #1 stop shop for all news in Martin County, Indiana, Daviess County, Indiana, and sometimes Monroe County, Indiana, since that is my old stomping grounds and where I was at. We want to thank our sponsors for this show, the Lagodi Big L Times. We also want to thank our sponsors over at Better Basic Brands, who helped pay for a trip that I had to the Indianapolis 500 back in the month of May. Better Basics sells anything clothes related or food related. Sells anything clothes related and clothing wear and keeping the environment growing. Better Basics is a fabric store but also a very big clothing brand and was sponsored of the 2025 Indianapolis 500. Better Basics. Be comfortable. Be you. And also, this episode is finally sponsored by Amazon Music. Thousands of people watch shows every day and also listen to podcasts like Joe Rogan or music by Sabrina Carpenter and Billie Eilish. Amazon Music is running its last few days of our sale. We're running the last few days of our deal for the entire summer. We're not coming back with this again. So you can get $5 off and use the Amazon code down in the description below to help me make more money this summer and acquire more funding. Thank you all so much, and have a great day. That's all the sponsors for now. Have a good day, and we look forward to seeing you next Sunday. Until then, stay safe.